My name is John Temin. I'm one of the non-resident senior associates here at CSIS and very pleased to be able to moderate this conversation with my friend Mbemba. We are talking about the relationship between Kenya and the DRC, the security aspects of that relationship, building on the really good conversation this morning about the economic aspects of that relationship. So what we're going to do here is Mbemba's going to present some findings from research that he and a colleague have been doing on the ground in both countries. Unfortunately, that colleague was going to join us virtually today. He had to step out at the last minute. So the conversation is going to be between Mbemba and me, but with lots of audience participation. So please do be thinking about the questions you want to insert into the conversation. We'll have plenty of time for that. As you'll hear from Mbemba, this is a robust relationship between Kenya and the DRC when it comes to security matters, and it's been especially robust recently. I'm sure everybody in this room is following developments in the DRC, but just to quickly rehash, because it is really important to the conversation. Last year, the M23 rebel movement made a significant advance throughout eastern DRC. They have captured two major cities, Goma, the capital of North Kivu province, Bukavu, the capital of South Kivu province. The Prime Minister of the DRC has said that 7,000 people have been killed in violence since the beginning of the year. He has said that 450,000 people have been displaced because IDP camps have been destroyed. There are other figures of up to 1 million people being displaced just in the area around Goma alone. M23 is saying that they intend to march to the capital and remove President Tshisekedi. By almost all accounts, as I'm sure you will have followed, M23 receives significant support from the Rwandan government, though the Rwandan government does officially deny that. U.S. made some moves on this just recently, sanctioning individuals in both Rwanda and with M23. The U.K. government just this week made a move to really distance themselves and place some limits on their relationship with Rwanda as well. So we're going to dig into all that. We're going to really unpack this relationship between the DRC and Kenya, but I'm sure Rwanda will come into the conversation too. I put down a list of Mbemba's very impressive achievements in his career, but I also suspect that you have gotten to know him throughout the day, so I might just say he's had a very impressive career. But obviously he is the director, senior fellow of the CSIS Africa program here. Over to him for a presentation, and then we'll talk.
Thank you very much. Actually, I want to come here, if that's all right. So the DRC and Kenya relations, as we heard today, go way back in the 60s. Right? The 1963, when Kenya achieved its independence. Before even that, Jomo Kenyatta has gotten involved in some negotiation over the war in DRC when hostages were being taken, American missionaries and so on. Then in 1966, right after General Mobutu then took over, he took over in 1965, December 24th. His first official visit outside the country was to Kenya. It was to Nairobi. It was about getting closer to Mzee Kenyatta. Kenya was, even though it was a younger country, they already established a certain level of standing on the international, on the world stage. So that was where Mobutu went. Mobutu didn't come to Washington, he didn't go to Brussels, he went to Nairobi for his first meeting. There were also other leaders there. But the current rapprochement, as we know it, as we've been discussing today, really dates back to when President Tshisekedi became president of DRC, Felix Tshisekedi. Before he became president of DRC, he had been in talks with then President Uhuru Kenyatta over many things, and Uhuru Kenyatta had given his blessing in supporting the platform that candidate Tshisekedi then, with his partner, another fellow named Vital Kamerhe, had created something called Cap pour le Changement, CASH. And that had the blessing of Uhuru Kenyatta. So by the time Tshisekedi became president, in a very contentious and contested process, Uhuru Kenyatta stood by him. When his inauguration arrived, there was only one foreign president who was there. and he was Uhuru Kenyatta, accompanied by Raila Odinga. So that relationship was very personal and personalized, and it was very tight. President Kenyatta eventually lost. Did not lose, but he exited, he finished his terms, and Ruto, his deputy, became president. As we all know, the relationship between President Ruto and his predecessor are not the best. But during the time that Ruto was getting close to Tshisekedi, it was also the time where Kenya had the chairmanship of the EAC. And during that time, Kenya, literally by its own sheer willpower and influence, brought the DRC into the EAC, more than doubling the size of the EAC. Now the EAC went from the Indian Ocean all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. There was a lot of what I call irrational exuberance over this, in the sense that the DRC had a lot of structural problems. It represents, obviously, a large market, and country in the EAC, those who were on board, not everybody was on board of DRC joining. Rwanda and Uganda, for instance, were not eager to see the DRC join. But eventually, the DRC represented a market. 100 million people, all the resources that we know the DRC has, was tingling everybody else, so everybody wanted to join. I think Kenya, to make this to work, President Kenyatta carved out a role for himself with the blessing of his peers in the EAC as the special envoy for the Great Lakes. That was fine. It's a situation I think that he had given to Ruto as a fait accompli. I'm the special envoy for the Great Lakes. So President Ruto had to accept it. We remember the shaking of hands when they were exchanging, transitioning power. It looked good. And then Kenya took the lead on the reaction force, EACRF, that was sent to DRC. Kenya took the leadership to that. But I remember speaking with a high-level official, Kenyan-level official, and asking him, what are you doing in the DRC? Do you even understand what is going on in the DRC? And that convinced said, I'm not really sure what we're doing in the DRC either. This landed on our lap because it was considered a Uhuru project. So that's one side. The other side is President Ruto as a politician himself. So while Uhuru Kenyatta had this tight relationship with Felix Tshisekedi that I described a few moments ago, well, Ruto did not develop that. During the campaign, on the campaign trail in Nyeri, I think when you're campaigning, it gets very exciting when you're in front of the microphone and all that stuff. President Ruto, I think, got carried away. He said jokingly, he didn't land that way in Kinshasa. He said, we're about to go over there in Congo, a 90 million strong nation of navel-wearing, trouser-wearing people, which all they do is dance, and they don't have a cow to produce milk. So the Congolese, for the most part, this was the first time they were discovering this person named Ruto, and he was not in the best of circumstances. Eventually, he did apologize. He did go to the Congolese embassy, but the damage was already done. So by the time he took the reins of power in Kenya, and he tried to then play the role that we know that Kenya wanted to play in peace process in Congo, he was already cast, or he had cast himself already to a certain light, because he was not seen as a friend of Congo. Yeah, this is a problem. And that problem is continuing to compound, right? It compounded, we heard about Emeti, RSF, but before Emeti, Corneille Nangaa, who's the head of the political side of the M23, had launched his group called the Alliance Fleuve Congo in Nairobi. He had gone to the Serena Hotel and made the announcement that we'll come and get Tshisekedi out, M23 and other people. So Uhuru condemned that. Ruto said it's freedom of speech. If your freedom of speech is allowing dissidents of your member state countries to come to your country and threaten war from your country, you're starting from a very weak position in terms of credibility. Yeah. So alongside this process was the deployment of the aircraft. The deployment of aircraft drove kind of to the heart of misunderstanding expectations. The EAC, as they put this force together, which was the first time they were putting such a force, I think they had a different type of understanding of what the Congolese will be expecting. The way that was sold, and the same way President Tshisekedi had sold the EAC, was this is going to bring stability, it's going to bring improvement in life, and so on. By the time the aircraft showed up with General Nyaga, who was the Kenyan commanding officer there was already a misunderstanding of what their mission was. So when I was asking the Kenyan official, do you know what you're getting yourself into? I don't think they'd factored in the expectations of the populations in Eastern Congo. They also did not factor the fact that, considering Congo is the size of Western Europe. Congo is the second largest African country. It's the only African country with 2 time zones, so it's big. Yeah. And because of that, the dynamics in the East vis-a-vis Kenya and countries in EAC are totally different from the dynamics in the rest of the country. The rest of the countries do not see EAC as particularly a partner. And the reason of that is all the countries that have destabilized Congo, helped destabilize Congo, are in EAC. So the Congolese, the average Congolese doesn't see EAC as a friendly organization, let's say in the way they see SADC or other organizations to which Congo behaves. So I think those sensitivities kind of escaped the Kenyans to start with. So by the time aircraft came, the population in North Kivu and other places were expecting them to have an offensive mandate, because in part that's how the Congolese politicians sold it. Where aircraft say, we don't have that mandate, our mandate is to be a buffer, to create space between the two. So automatically when you take that, you take some of the communications that came out of Nairobi, the announcement, the launch of the Alliance Fleuve Congo in Nairobi, it didn't send particularly the most reassuring message. So as Kenya hosted the Nairobi process, there's some other problem that emerged. Kenya was footing the bill. I presume they're still footing the bill. I don't know if they got support from our friends in Washington and elsewhere. But this was a process that Uhuru had initiated. The challenge, one of the challenges with that process is the vetting. Who was brought to the table? We often talk about Eastern Congo having anywhere from 40 to 120 armed groups. Well, which one? Which one do you bring to Nairobi? What do they represent? Because the armed groups are also seen as protectors of their communities, some of them anyway. It turned out that some of the people who were in Nairobi were not necessarily known in the communities. The people who were known in the community were not necessarily in Nairobi. Some people were known in the community, the leaders didn't want to be in Nairobi, because in case the process goes south, they want to have a distance from it, right? To keep a distance, to say, I was never there anyway. So they sent some of the junior staff and associates to go there. So there were a lot of these things that were just not aligning properly or conspiring properly for the interests of peace in the region. And then you add to that the Luanda process. So you wonder then which process is going to take the leadership over this. In the meantime, we also saw that whatever conflict that existed between Uhuru Kenyatta and Ruto did not abate. It continued. Then by the time you add Raila Odinga in the mix, it was a different cocktail altogether. So let's just see what the mandates of aircraft said. The mandate said, they had to plan and conduct joint operation with FRDC, the Congolese army, to defeat the armed group element in Eastern DRC. So as far as the Congolese were concerned, that meant M23 and so on. As far as Rwanda and other people, other groups were concerned, they were like, that means FDLR and the other guys. So it's like, who's going to do that? Support FRDC in establishing and maintaining public order. Assist the DRC in collaboration with humanitarian agencies in continuing humanitarian aid delivery to populations affected by the activities of elements of armed groups, including internal displaced persons. And support the disarmament, demobilization, community recovery, and stabilization programs. So all these things were supposed to be carried out by aircraft. It was just not possible. So the expectation, this is what I mean by misunderstanding the expectations of local population. That's one set of issues. The communication also remained a problem because in the meantime, President Ruto, Kenya, for instance, I think Kenya saw itself as a neutral element, actor in this thing. The Congolese never saw Kenya as a neutral actor. In fact, I think when President Ruto shows up in Kinshasa and doing a press conference, it became very clear that the tension was very strong between he and President Tshisekedi, right in the middle of press conference. You could sense that. And then later on, as tension continued to rise, and President Tshisekedi sending messaging that is totally different from what is coming out of Nairobi, the two literally crossed at a summit, where President Tshisekedi just let it out, and President Ruto did the same. It was not that diplomatic. And then fast forward at a summit in Nairobi, President Ruto was in front of a microphone, I think it was Jeune Afrique, one of these newspapers, and they asked him about the M23 and so on. And he said, I've been told they're Congolese. Are they Congolese or not? This is a touchy subject in Congo because Congolese don't believe the M23 is Congolese. They believe there's some Congolese element in M23, but they don't believe the group is Congolese. So this added another layer to that discredibility or discredit that the Congolese have come to cast on the main key actor in the peace process in Nairobi, which is President Ruto himself. So what does this mean? I think it means a lot of things. We came up with some recommendations here that I'll just read. We believe that in terms of perspectives and recommendations, we need to look closely at opportunity to make the most of the opportunities and contribute to peace, cooperation, and justice in the region. So because of that, we recommend that they reestablish and revitalize direct political dialogue between the heads of states in the DRC and Kenya to ensure high-level political engagement, because that relationship is actually broken. Unlike what we were describing earlier about BCDC and Equity Bank, that's a different world altogether. The banks are like this, they're aligned, the politicians are not. It's totally different. We recommend that we relaunch the conversation on judicial cooperation related to regional and international judicial mechanism for the DRC and encourage countries in the region to show strong commitment to it. Only this can stem this cycle of impunity that cements conflicts and instability in the region. And this has been highlighted in the framework agreement on peace, security, and cooperation for the DRC and the region that was signed at Addis Ababa several years ago. We also believe that Kenya itself, because Kenya is so vested in what's happening in DRC. We talked about Equity Bank just in 2023 reaping about $102 million worth of profit in DRC. Just that alone, without counting where Kenya is invested in oil and other sectors, transportation, and so on, it is worth Kenya considering building a stronger bilateral defense and security partnership with the DRC. That partnership doesn't exist. EACRF, yes, in one way it's a security thing, but it's a reaction force. It's not a real partnership. There were some Kenyan instructors, infantry instructors, KDF infantry instructors up in Kisangani, training some infantry brigade there. We think they need more of that. Kenya has just achieved a major non-NATO status they should use it to experience more stuff and strengthen places like DRC. Kenya is, at this point, the ear of the West and Western powers because of its engagement in many places, including Haiti. I think Kenya can leverage that better. And then we also recommend that they should be mindful of the fact that the opening of borders within the framework of the EAC introduces a new level of complexity in the fight against transborder crime and terrorism in the region. So this necessitates enhanced cooperation, both integration of intelligence and strengthen regional capabilities with additional expertise and support for global actors such as the United States. So while this is a regional framework of dynamics in terms of security, we believe countries like the United States and other partners of Kenya and DRC have a role to play. But Kenya cannot come into DRC only counting on the financial and economic kind of positive profit and then ignoring the security thing, particularly because the region that is closer to Kenya, where Kenyan businessmen are mostly invested, is Eastern Congo, as we heard in our first panel. So you cannot dissociate that from, say, we're going to go there because a market of 100 million. Well, that's fine. But what about all these other issues? So Kenya has an opportunity, but I don't think they're seizing that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mbemba. And I want to continue on that last point that you ended on, because you're talking about these, parallel tracks of the economic relationship and the political relationship. You think about all the equities that President Ruto has in play between economic and political and security, and he's got this relationship with his predecessor that is so fraught, that is in the background. Kenya wants to be seen as a global player on peace and security issues. They don't want the Nairobi process to fail. They've had troops in the DRC. How do you think he balances all this? Because he can't afford to just do the political. He has to think about it all. So, if you're in his ear, how do you think he builds a more holistic relationship with the country at this moment?
I think it's difficult. We need to start there. But Kenya needs a special envoy for the region, and one who's credible. Now, Uhuru had carved out that space for himself. I don't think Ruto will particularly want him to be there. But they have to find somebody else. Somebody else who can drive that relationship, somebody who probably was there when the President Uhuru was designing, that initiative at the time. But the credibility is not there. And another problem is, in East Africa, they think they understand DRC, but they don't. It's just as simple as that. They don't. They don't have a long history of engaging with DRC. The average East African think every Congolese is a musician, because that's their contact with DRC. If you talk to East Africans about Congo, you hear all kinds of things. If you talk to West Africans about Congo, it's a different Congo that they see. They are much more closer to what Congo really is than you find in East Africa. So there's, I think, I'll tell President Ruto, send somebody that you trust who can gain the trust of the Congolese to be the point person, and refrain from making comments that do not actually reflect the reality on the ground, because it undermines Kenya. It doesn't not just undermine President Ruto, it undermines Kenya. You go from Uhuru to Ruto, and then one day Ruto will be out. But that impression of Kenya is most likely to stay. So special envoy will be good, but also, as I said, find other areas of collaboration with the DRC, not just economics.
Yeah. And of course, we have to focus on the enormous level of violence happening in Eastern DRC right now, and decades of that violence. Do you think Kenya is the right player to play the type of leadership role in conflict resolution in the East?
I think they could have been. I think they missed a few opportunities. I don't think it's too late. They started well. I mean, they do have the leadership. They have the wherewithal. In the region, if you consider EAC, outside Kenya, I think The other country that could have played that role is Tanzania. I'm not sure how interested the Tanzanians are in playing the role, but I think Kenya can still play the role. They just have to adjust a lot and quickly.
Yeah, and Tanzania has never really asserted themselves outside their borders.
No,
the way
they're very happy
Kenya
within
has.
their borders. They don't want to project too much.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, any conversation of what's happening in the East has to involve Rwanda. And
Correct.
so I want you to talk in a more trilateral way here, because Kenya has its own bilateral relationship with Rwanda. But I think most people would agree that any resolution to what's happening in Eastern DRC, changing behavior from Kigali, is a big part of that.
Yes.
Talk to us about that relationship. Talk to us about any sort of leverage that Nairobi may have.
Leverage. Nobody has leverage, a lot of leverage on Rwanda these days. But
Small country.
small country, big ego, big aspirations, and many other things. Big concerns as well, on a serious note. They have concerns that are legitimate, that we should take into consideration. This is a country that went through a genocide. This is a country that, because of the size, feel like things can go south very quickly. It doesn't take much. It's a small country. So they're hypersensitive when it comes to security. I think Kenya is the largest economy in the region, with banking that are strong, with an agriculture sector that is strong, with a strong diplomacy, can play a major role. But I think that role cannot be one that is neutral on principles. Invading your country is not cool, to use the street language. It's just not. Not just Kenya, every member at EAC need to say, this is not acceptable. What is the problem? I think doing peace processes with rebels is not going to solve the problem in DRC. Right? Because you're bringing people with the big guns. The guys who rape the most, the group that has a bigger gun, the group who committed more massacres, those are the guys who get to Nairobi. Just say the DRC is the size of Western Europe. What about the rest of the country? The rest of the country is not interested in what's M20. The news is about M23 and everybody else. The average Congolese is not interested in that stuff.
Really?
No, not at all.
Even as they take more and more territory and
they take
talk about their ambitions. There's a history of rebel groups starting out there. And
correct,
moving.
but then it's always, the result of that is a multiplication of armed groups. Right? Remember, there was no armed group in the Kivus. There used to be the Congolese army in the days. There was ADF that was there since 86 or so. FDLR came in. They were not FDL at the time. They were the Rwandan army, defunct Rwandan army that were causing trouble in Rwanda. The armed groups only start emerging when Rwanda occupied the region. So in the same way that blaming everybody doesn't solve the problem, just arming everybody and occupying cities does not bring peace.
Yeah.
So I think Kenya, countries like Kenya, if they wanted to, I don't know if they're willing to do this, they have to take leadership about that real peace, not talking to militias, because that's what the Nairobi process is. It's not a peace process. It's trying to calm down militias and see what they need to lay down. But what I'm talking about in terms of peace, I'm talking there need to be a country in the way the US played a role between Israel and Egypt. Peace is between countries, not between individuals. Because in reality today, if you go on the border, we were just there in October, the borders are open. You wonder, what kind of war is this? The border is open, the Rwandan immigration official sits literally here, there's a partition here, the Congolese immigration officers sit right here. They eat lunch together, they see each other, they go to the same bathroom. So what is your war? Yeah? You go to Kigali, you go to Rwanda, thousands of Congolese live in Rwanda. Thousands of Rwandans cross the border every day. So where is the war? Embassies were open until recently, until President Tshisekedi decided he's going to recall his ambassador.
Yep.
So it's absurd. I think somebody has to start calling these people out and say, Kinshasa, what is your problem? Kigali, Kampala, what is your problem? This is embarrassing everyone. It's embarrassing the people in the region. The same families live across the border. So what exactly is it? Rwanda, you want to exterminate or finish FDLR? Okay, the DRC has given you the light to do this. You've had joint operations for many years. Is that what you want? What is the point? If FDLR is in the bush, in the mountain, where is the correlation between FDLR in the mountain and laying siege in Goma and killing 3,000 people in Goma? They're not FDLR. No FDLR has been killed in Goma. There's no FDLR in Bukavu. There's definitely no FDLR in Uvira. So are we looking for FDLR or are we looking for something else?
Yeah. Well, and you make an important point about the conflict's going to be resolved in capitals, not with the rebels. But you also made a really important point in the paper and just now in the remarks, these questions about who do you bring to the table in negotiations? Because yes, you have to make a lot of progress in capitals. You also have to silence the guys with guns. You're pointing to a problem that happens in so many different negotiation processes of sort of where do we draw the line as to who gets a seat at the table. And the problem of these sort of perverse incentives that come out where if you're a rebel group and you become more violent, then you get a seat at the table, then you get some of the spoils that come out of the negotiations.
And then you get a position in Kinshasa.
Exactly.
As a minister.
So with Nairobi leading a lot of this process, like what would you advise them? What are they learning from some trial and error that they've been through?
I mean, we've seen this before. I'll just say we need to have the courage to challenge all the party and say, this is not working on either side. It's not working. This is M23-2, right? So it's not like it worked the first time. It didn't work. What I think I'll say the same thing I said a while back. What is the problem? What is the real problem? What is your real problem? If you were the chairman of the Electoral Commission that ran a botched election, and you declare candidate Tshisekedi president, and you were convinced that he won, you never published the list of polling stations as we've observed the election, so we know how that works. And then 5 years later you say, he never won. I can tell you he never won. But I want to be your president, and by the way, I'm going to kill along the way to become your president. I mean, this guy should not have been in any room where we're doing this negotiation. By all standards, by African standards, by EAC standards, but yet these are the people we are using as our interlocutor. So my response say, let's kill that process. Let's start a real process of peace. You know, like the Congolese did in Sun City. They went and sat there. Well, let's have and then the other element is, okay, Rwanda, come on. It's been 30 years that you've been denying that you're involved. Everybody says you're involved. The satellite pictures, and yet you want peace. I mean, how do you get peace when one party says, I'm not part of this? It's not me. It's not me. Your satellites are lying. Those guys it's not me. I think that's what I mean. Like it's a Gordian knot.
Yeah. Somebody
has to cut it. And Africans in Nairobi, in Dar es Salaam, everywhere else need to have the courage to say, this makes no sense anymore.
Yeah. Last question for me, and so I encourage folks to line up behind the microphone if you have questions in the audience. But Mbemba, I'm wondering what the experience of Kenya in peacemaking in Nairobi says to you about the larger peace and security architecture in Africa. And in particular, the role of continental organizations, even international organizations, because the AU likes to defer to its sub-regional entities when it can. The UN likes to defer to the AU when it can. But not a lot is working in this architecture. What do you take away?
It's not working, so that's the part I take away. I'm not a believer in the AU. I think the AU should fold and they should go home. I just don't think they're relevant in the average African's life, not just in Congo, around the world. If the AU folded tomorrow, where's the difference? What does the Kenya farmer, what they're going to feel? Nothing. What does the Ethiopian guy will feel? What's the average Botswana feel about AU closing? Nothing. Because they're very irrelevant in that way. I think it's too much of cut and paste. There's a European Union, we want to have an African Union. Really? We don't need to have an African. On the other hand, I believe in regional organizations. So the EACs of the world, the SADC of the world, I think they have a lot to offer. But in order for them to really deliver, they have to get serious about their charters, about what really they stand for. I think there's too much mismatch. You know, I used to wonder several years ago, when SADC meet, and you have Joseph Kabila in there, and you have Mugabe, and you have Sam Nujoma, and then you have Mbeki, and you wonder, what do they talk about? Because these are people from totally different perspectives. You know, Mbeki is like the ultimate democrat. He wants to do everything right. You have Zimbabwe over there. Mugabe says, I'm your father and your big daddy. Not say anything against me. You have Kabila saying you don't understand DRC. So as long as we have this kind of mismatch, it's not going to work. So that leaves us with a situation where, you know, Ale was talking earlier about Eritrea and on a panel earlier, about the earlier panel on the Horn, Eritrea and Ethiopia coming to an understanding. Well, they did it without AU, they did it in South Africa, they did their things. So I think in the case of DRC or the Great Lakes, that's what we need. We need a country that is serious about committing to bringing these parties together and trying to push it forward. Mm-hmm. Until that happens, everybody passes the buck.
Let's turn to the audience if we have any questions. Please, if your questions, let's please line up at the microphone. I think that's the process we're using, so let's take a couple.
Okay. So thank you so much for what you have shared in the conversation so far. My question is actually an extension of what the last point you just made. I see this existing tension where you say Kenya does not understand the region, this is the DRC, but also Kenya is making waves in the region right now and they can better leverage themselves. And we can learn lessons from South Sudan where we see Western aid is brought in, and because they don't understand the structural root issues of the country, it doesn't guarantee peace at all up until now. So my question is, how can we navigate? Could you talk more about how this commitment looks like, if anything? Because either way, it's a country that's coming in.
And what's your affiliation, name and affiliation?
My name is Sandia Taban, and I do work with the Aspen Institute under the Global Leadership Network program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Why don't we take two questions and then the next two?
Thank you so much. Dennis Owing, Uganda National Academy of Sciences. My question is on judicial cooperation under the East African Community. So we have the East African Community Court of Justice. Could this be a multilateral space through which DRC can raise its grievances against EAC or EAC member countries that are causing conflicts in Eastern DRC? Thank you.
All right. I mean, to Sandia's question, I don't mean to imply here this is easy. It's not easy. You know, it takes tremendous commitment, financial, leadership, but somebody has to take that commitment if the people who are doing, because this conflict is affecting everyone. The IDPs, millions of them in DRC, the Congolese refugees all over the place, from Kenya to Tanzania to Uganda. Some other countries in Africa have actually, they try to say, we host the most refugees. Well, that's not a good sign if you host most refugees. You know, because a lot of these countries are also creating refugees by their actions. So I believe simply, short of what I've already said in terms of, you cannot have regional organization where nobody respects the norms, where the same countries are attacking each other. Are you in the same organization or not? It doesn't work like that. I mean, Europeans don't attack each other. They don't go killing each other in the name of this and the name of that. The entire thing is integration, welfare of the people, economic seamlessness, and all that stuff. So to me, I think, again, I'm going to go back to the case of Eritrea and Ethiopia. They had a guarantor, they went and did their thing. Unless that happens, in the case of South Sudan, Kenya played a major role with the CPA. So you need a parrain, as we call in French, a godfather of sorts, who can come and take ownership of that process and say, we're going to make sure this works. And it's happened many times. In the case of DRC, the DRC was bound to collapse in 1960. Yeah, you had secession in Katanga, you had secession in Bakwanga, literally 10 days after independence the country was. And there were countries that were pulling left and right? The Belgians wanted Katanga, the Brits wanted an extension of the Rhodesia into Katanga. You had all kinds of factors there. Two countries stood and say, Congo is not going to break. The United States and the USSR at the time. The US put as much as it could for Congo to remain together. That's how Congo survived. There have to be a country that takes responsibility. We saw this in Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone was struggling quite a bit until somebody reminded Tony Blair that his father had been a lecturer at the University of Freetown. And the UK eventually decided they're going to become the godfather of Sierra Leone. That's how Sierra Leone changed. Not because the Sierra Leonean continue going back and forth. No, there was a country that said, I'm going to step in here and help you create the conditions to peace, including the tribunal and all that's followed.
I would just add, it's worth noting on your example of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in South Sudan and Kenya's role, they played a very central role. They had the strong backing of the US in that role, and that's...
No, so that country, as I said earlier, we need other countries beyond, because this African country may not have the means to do everything or all the credibility. In the case of Angola, in the Luanda process, the US was very supportive of the Luanda process behind João. But I think there has to be a country that is willing to play that role forcefully, not kind of on the one hand and on the other hand. No, it cannot be on one. Peace is not about one hand and the other hand. It's either peace or no peace.
Yeah. And the question about the East African Court of Justice, do you see that as
the East Africa Court of Justice will suffer the same thing. If the East Africa community is not working, that reflects in those, because it's about credibility. Right? So the Congolese have been wanting a truth and reconciliation process for a long time, and they've not gotten any traction. We cannot underestimate the role of court, but I think we cannot underestimate the role of truth and reconciliation processes. Rwanda has had one, Sierra Leone, Liberia, South Africa. The DRC still has not had that thing. And as long as that doesn't happen, impunity feeds. That's why you can have somebody like Corneille Nangaa, he can botch the elections over here, and then 5 years later he says, I'm going to be your next president. I mean, in what world that logic holds?
Yeah.
It does not. It's only holds in the world where we create space for people with big guns.
Although it's interesting to think about a TRC-type process in a country where an external actor is such a major force, because most of the ones that you talked about, it's an internal conflict along various lines.
No, correct. But Charles Taylor is sitting in jail for Sierra Leone, not for Liberia.
That is true.
So it does happen all the time.
That is true. I think we had two more questions in here.
Hi, my name is Joshua Charles. I'm with the CEO of Frontier Dominion. In recognition, so my question is as follows, in recognition of the developments concerning the Lobito corridor. Clearly the US has, you can argue that to some extent, the stability of the DRC is in America's national interest. And so as this conflict develops, what potential policies can the US government impose to help facilitate some peace with the DRC, Rwanda, Kenya, and what have you? Thank you.
My name is Isaac Mutemi, Master of International Affairs at Columbia University. Thank you very much to CSIS for this fantastic forum. I've learned a lot, lots more to go and think about. I'd just like to point out a gray area that has sort of tracked throughout the course of the meeting. I noticed that when we talk about Kenya's involvement in the DRC, the story sort of begins in 1967 or 66. then goes quiet, and then comes back again in 2018 or 2017 when Uhuru gets on the scene, which leaves out an entire sort of 4 decades where Congo was very active, or at least it was an active scene for many African countries that had lots of interest in it. I think we're talking at least a dozen African countries were involved in conflicts and other processes happening in DRC over that time. So the fact that, number one, Kenya was not involved, or either was not involved or is not reported to have been involved in those processes. And then secondly, that now it's getting on the scene without the baggage of history or the institutional memory from all those processes that happened. That also tracks to the present moment, where now when we come to talk about Kenya in the current scenario, we are sort of beholden to the personal characteristics of Uhuru and Ruto, rather than talking about more substantial institutional arrangement that considers the history and the structure of the two countries. So I think there is some room there to explore the processes that were happening in that interim period that are not reflected on, and that has a bearing on what happens next after the presidency of Ruto and whoever else comes on. Thanks.
Why don't we take those two, and if there's time for one more, we will squeeze it in.
Okay, so the Lobito corridor, in the Africa program, we wonder a lot what's going to happen with the Lobito corridor. There's a new administration in town. The Lobito corridor was a flagship program of the last administration. So as the new administration is reviewing their own engagement with Africa on, I don't know if it's on a country-by-country basis or project-by-project or agency-by-agency project, we are curious to see how it's going to happen. So it's very hard to respond to that question now. So as long as the administration has not made clear its position, we know that the DFC, I think, has its executive director now. So we will wait to see. We really cannot answer that question until the administration makes its position clear.
I think the question was getting at more broad U.S. engagement as well. And I will say that, the administration has been fairly energetic on Eastern DRC.
If it's a broader, the second half of that question, though, it will be, the Lobito corridor is about minerals. Right? So the U.S. doesn't need the Lobito corridor to get to the minerals in Congo. They can get to the minerals. Tshisekedi just wanted them to come. The New York Times had an article a few days ago where Tshisekedi said, please come. The question for the U.S., the interest is there, so we know this. Is the U.S. willing to put money? Are there American companies that are willing to compete with, who? The Chinese, who have put a lot of their money into this project. So that's also something, that's why I was talking about the DFC. Because if the DFC is going to avail money, or at least for de-risking, for risk guarantees, maybe we'll see more of this. But until that happens, American companies have been a bit timid in investing in places like Congo, even while we all talk about the importance of critical minerals. And now that we've been talking about the minerals in Ukraine, so we also have to see if all the attention will go to Ukraine and forget everything else down there. Then in terms of the 30 war, so the gray area, there's actually no gray area. For 32 years, for about 30 years, Congo worked. It was not Norway, but it worked. Yeah? It was a regional power. So there was no need for Kenya, for anybody else. Congo, before Mobutu collapsed, Congo was the go-to country for the United States in the region. In part, it is part of the problem today because the neighboring country don't want that Congo to come back. Nobody wants a Mobutu to emerge. By default, given what Congo has as potential, if it starts working again, it's going to be what it used to be, if not more. So if you are Rwanda, if you are Zambia, there's an element, if you're Angola, there's an element, we want this not to collapse fully, because it's consequences for us. But we don't want it to be what it was in 1975. So how do we then, as neighbors, where the neighbors will think, what is the right dosage of a functional Congo? Just how much should it work that we can accept? That's the question. Yeah? So the gray zone, that would be the gray zone. But I think Kenya has an advantage still, in spite of everything that I say, and I hope that comes true. Kenya doesn't have a long history of engagement, a negative engagement in DRC. So as they're coming in with a lot of positive. But when it comes to peace and security, that's where the problem is. That's where I think the leadership of Kenya needs to be a bit stronger and clear beyond personal characteristics of Uhuru or Kenyatta or wherever, so that is country to country, and Congolese can see Kenya as a real partners in their national psyche. That's what is missing.
We have time for one more question. The gentleman back here.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, you have more or less preempted the question I wanted to ask, because I was wondering, when are you going to mention the impact of minerals in Eastern Congo as part of the conflict that has been going on for many years? Because it's very difficult to talk about Eastern Congo without mentioning the presence of the minerals. And the reasons why, at some point we had, I think, 9 African countries providing peacekeeping in various places in the Congo. And it so happened that most of those areas could have had even minerals there. So could that be the issue to be addressed from the economic perspective before even political and security? Because the minerals is the driving, force for some of these countries to get involved and to continue the conflict. I don't know what you think.
The minerals are part of it. They're not the only driver. It's one of the drivers for certain countries. I think we cannot underscore the governance problem on the DRC side. I've not mentioned a lot because we're talking about Kenya, but the DRC has a set of problems, which include bad governance, weak leadership in Kinshasa, difficulty articulating its vision for itself on the world stage. And that's the gray zone Isaac was referring. During the gray zone, which I call the dark ages of Congo, because when people study Congo, they all remember King Leopold and his ghosts and all this. And then we jump. We go straight to rapes and the Kivus and everything. But there was a country there named Zaire for 32 years. And for most of that time, it's worked okay. It was, as I said, it was not Norway, it was not Sweden. But as far as African countries were concerned, it worked fine. It was okay. It had a lot of potential and worked fine. So minerals, yes. But bad governance is also a serious problem. I think when we talk about mineral, one element that has come into focus is the EU memorandum of understanding with Rwanda on mines. The EU, in this quest of critical minerals, signed an understanding, memorandum of understanding with Rwanda, is a provider of minerals. Now, all of us who study the region know that Rwanda does not have large reserves, not as of yet. Yeah, maybe prospection will show that they have a lot, but as of now, they don't. So when the EU signed this memorandum of understanding, where are they expecting the Rwandans to get the minerals from? So there's no coincidence that the M23 finds itself in some of the region where some of the largest reserves of coltans are, like Rubava and other places. So that's one element, but I will not say is the only element, but it's definitely very important. So what do we do for that? I think Rwanda, all of us who visited Rwanda, we have reason to be impressed. The roads are good, they get all the meetings on time, there's a certain vision there. So if Rwanda were to legitimately develop refineries and industry that will add value to what is in the Kivu, why not? But you cannot just invade your neighbor because they have weak governance. I mean, many countries have weak governance. Their neighbors don't invade them. Congo is not unique with weak governance, particularly if you contributed to that weak governance by continually supporting militias in the country or by continually invading that country. Well, when they're going to build the good governance that you need to have a neighbor who can guarantee your security. So it's a bit of a vicious circle. As I was saying earlier, we have 120 whatever number of armed militias because Rwanda and Uganda invaded. Before that, those guys didn't exist. Now with Bukavu, now with Goma, there will be more of those guys. It's just a matter of time before a new group emerges.
A lot of things work well in Rwanda, but there's a story behind that too.
There we go.
You're telling part of that story, and that's an important thing for people to remember. I see 1 minute left on the clock, and I'm going to take advantage of that, and I'm going to ask you one final question. I want you to look into your crystal ball and tell me 5 years from now what you think the Kenya-DRC relationship looks like.
5 years from now, the Kenya-DRC relationship will look on whatever, depending on whatever Ruto does today. And I don't think they've lost. I think the Kenyans can still come back. If they were to appoint a special envoy, if they have to appoint a go-between the two countries who's trustworthy, who get the trust of both sides, that can be salvaged, particularly on the security. In terms of economics, it will continue to grow. I don't think that's going anywhere.
All right. Thank you, Mbemba. Really appreciate a great conversation here. I've had a chance to read the report that's going to come out that Mbemba and his colleague read. It's fantastic. I recommend it to everybody when it is published.
It's out today. It's already on.
Everybody go home and read it.
So all our reports are online. You can download them and give us feedback. But I also want to take this opportunity to thank all our panelists who joined us today. So Robina, Mwachofi, Hale, am I missing somebody? Beverly, and also Balingene who joined us from the field. Also the Africa team, so my colleague Cameron, our associate fellow Catherine Zuki, Hasai Mahulo, who was actually the backbone of all the processes that led to the publication of this report. She was in the field, she booked the hotel, she managed the interview, she managed the editing process, she managed this process today. So, she managed me, she's my boss. So again, and I'm gonna turn the time. We have a few more minutes for you. I'll turn the time to my colleague Cameron. Thank you again, John.
Thank you.
Thanks, Femba. I'm given the always enviable task of trying to make sense and encapsulate and tie off loose ends, everything that we heard today. So it dawned on me I should have had ChatGPT listening to the day's events and then told it to give me a concise summary of common themes, and I didn't do that. Instead, what I did is furiously read through my notes from the day and try to capture some of the brilliance of our panelists and speakers, and hopefully can thread together some of the big takeaways, at least some of my big takeaways from the conversations today. And I think one thing that struck me from when the ambassador spoke this morning was this idea that Kenya has been drawn out of its cocoon, that it was in a cocoon, that attacks on the U.S. Embassy, Westlake, that these drew Kenya out and provoked it to look beyond its borders, to look at the region in a new, more fundamental way. He talked about the kind of triple lens through which Kenya views its interests and its own policies, the collective interest of the region, its own strategic national interests, and then, of course, the interests of the ruling elites. And we heard how those elites, through the various presidential administrations, have defined their outlook, both near and far. The ambassador also spoke about the 5 pillars of Kenyan diplomacy, and I think we touched upon those throughout the course of the day. Peace diplomacy, regional diplomacy, environmental diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, and commercial diplomacy were all mentioned by the ambassador. And I think at one point or another throughout the day, we touched on all of those. I think certainly peace diplomacy and regional diplomacy were the two, the two biggest themes that we interrogated today, particularly in the DRC, but also in the Horn of Africa. But one thing I think that underpins all of the various forms of Kenyan diplomacy that gives it its strength and that makes it influential across the board is this internal stability that Kenya has been able to draw on for so much of its modern period, which distinguishes it from many of its neighbors and many of its regional allies in the EAC and certainly in the Horn of Africa. And so I think that uniqueness is part of Kenya's strength. We spoke a lot about whether or not Kenya was an anchor state. And I think it's fair to say my takeaway from this is it's clearly an anchor state in the EAC. But as Haile argued, can it really be an anchor state in two regions? And he didn't think it could be, and probably isn't, I think, an anchor state in the Horn of Africa. But unlike Ethiopia, which has experienced sustained levels of authoritarianism and bouts of internal instability, Nairobi has used this history of internal peace and stability to brand itself as a capital of peace, not just in the region, but I think on the African continent. And that is quite a triumph, given that Ethiopia houses the African Union. But we all know, and we've all been to many conferences in Nairobi, where and even critically calling out the RSF for hosting a parallel government announcement in Nairobi just 10 days ago. But we've heard from Kenyans throughout the day that Nairobi as a center and Kenya as a center of peacemaking and peace building is critical to its identity in the region and internationally. I don't want to leave out what we heard about Kenya's leadership on the climate agenda either, both locally, regionally, and globally. We've recognized that Kenya has unique vulnerabilities around climate, but we've also seen that it has taken those vulnerabilities and turned them into leadership opportunities, whether through its own domestic legislation, the creation of public-private partnerships, its carbon markets initiative. It exemplifies climate resilience among a set of peer countries which are also facing many of the same challenges but have not stepped up nearly in the way that Kenya has done. It's clear also that Kenya has the ear of powerful countries outside of the continent. I think the message that I took away, though, is that Kenya can do better to leverage the influence that it has with those countries, both in the region and outside the region. It can do a better job on regional peace and security, on regional integration, on climate finance issues. As much as it is a leader on those issues, it has not yet met its full potential. I think we agreed that Kenya was not a hegemon on the continent, but that it has a global agenda and global ambitions that go well beyond the continent. I think the United States and other countries share that agenda for Kenya because it is in a unique position for being able to project both power and influence to the borders of its country, but then beyond the borders of its country as well. I'm reminded of the long list of attributes that Ambassador Bellamy started the day talking about in terms of the strong institutions, the levels of education, the strong infrastructure, the strategic location of Kenya. But I think a question that has come up repeatedly over the course of the day is whether or not Kenya is more than just the sum of its parts. Has it catalyzed all of the natural attributes, all of the historical attributes that it has in order to meet the ambitions that it has for itself and that others have for it? And I think the answer to both of those questions today is no, or maybe more precisely, not yet. Again, we heard from Rembe in this last session about Kenya's role as peacemaker and peace builder, and he has said, I think provocatively as well, that they have not met up with those ambitions, at least not in the DRC. And so as much as I think we've had a very frank and analytic conversation about Kenya's role in the region and in the world, I think we can't ignore the fact that there is no other country in either the EAC or the IGAD that is positioned to play the role that Kenya is currently playing, nor is there a country on the horizon that will likely overtake Kenya, I think, in the near term, to play the role that it is playing right now, let alone the role that it wishes to play in the future. And so the question that I leave here with today is, when and under what conditions will Kenya be able to play the role locally, regionally, and internationally that it wants to play and that we need it to play? So it hasn't achieved those ambitions or met the expectations that we have of it. We will see how it recovers from some of the recent setbacks that we talked about earlier, losing the African Union chairmanship, or I think the black spot reputationally that the doctor talked about earlier today of hosting the rebel RSF group in Nairobi recently. But at the same time, I take away from this that we should not count Kenya out for meeting its ambitions or the ambitions that we have for it. So with that, I want to, on behalf of my friend and colleague, Vemba Dizulele, thank you all for coming to this marathon session. I can't read your lips. Thank you. Obviously, thanking our partner and benefactor for this conference, the Open Society Foundations, who contributed to this discussion today at the beginning of the discussion, but also in innumerable ways throughout the course of this long process to bring this research to you. So thank you to them, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. That concludes our conference.